I will do my best to stay awake myself, and hopefully in doing so, keep everyone else awake as well. Definitely a great time of fellowship. We had, a little while back, the ladies rearranged the room and made it to where we could all sit at one table and see each other, and there have been some gaps at times, but no gaps today. So that was extremely good to see. And there were no gaps in the food either. There was plenty there. So plenty of fellowship, plenty of opportunities there for smiles, and now for heavy eyelids that follow that. But as part of this is, that's not the reason we're gathered here today as a whole. So definitely a bonus that we have on the first day of the first Sunday of the month. But in looking at this afternoon's lesson, worship in spirit and truth. So we've got this section of Scripture that talks about that element of how their worship is going to change. And it's interesting, Christ is talking to the woman at the well, who is actually a Samaritan woman, so not even of the nation of Israel, but it was a blended where they kind of sort of followed, but kind of did other things. And so the question comes up about worship. So John chapter 4, starting in verse 19, is where he's talked to the woman a little bit, caught her attention, and now the focus of worship comes in verse 19. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where you ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews." Remembering that Jesus is still under the law of Moses in the Old Testament at this time. And continues, "But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." And Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." So another good illustration point for this morning's lesson, that Christ came bearing the message for all. He even gave it to Samaritans. Don't tell the Jewish leadership, they might not like that part. But looking at the idea that he gave right before that is talking about the worship. As we gather together on this first day of the week, why is it so special? What makes it special? What makes it worship? Jesus gives us this idea that we must do it in spirit and in truth. And so kind of an overview of this, and after I saw this verse, and this verse kind of went, I'm like, okay, that'll be a good lesson for today. And as I was developing the lesson, I'm like, perhaps another series. And we'll go through the different acts of worship as we go forward. But before we can perform the acts of worship in our service together, we have to understand what it actually is. So looking at the definition itself of worship, it's interesting looking at the New Testament because worship is not in the original languages. It's not in the original Greek or Hebrew, but yet we have words as we read our Bible that say worship. It said right here twice, worship. So if we look at a dictionary definition of the word worship, it is a religious reverence and homage, especially the act of paying divine honors to God. A lot of the words that are translated worship are actually coming from the two root words of either proskuneo or latrio. If you disagree with pronunciation, we can discuss later, or think what you'd like. I'm not a Greek scholar. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I do not know exactly. But in looking at these two words, they are both transliterated into the word worship because it's not a direct changeover. So looking at first the word proskuneo, means to fall down or prostrate oneself, to adore on one's knee. Think of the image of going up to a leader, and there's certain cultures especially, that when they go up to their leader, they bend down to a knee, they bow down before him, to bow down, to kiss the feet of, to prostrate oneself is what it looks like. We are bringing ourselves down and bowing down before that person. That is the idea behind this particular word. We see this several times, and I've got several verses here of where proskuneo is actually used, where thinking of some of these situations where someone would bow down before Christ. They would bow down to worship him. When we look at that idea, today, I use the President of the United States comes in, our custom is to stand up into the room instead to show that respect. But, here it would be they would bow to their leaders. And so the idea of that proskuneo, are we willing to bow ourselves down before God? Think of the times even in the Old Testament when all of a sudden, you are on hallowed ground. They would take their feet out of their shoes. They would take the shoes off or their sandals off. They would bow before. They would not take and try and look up to. They would have so much awe and respect for him. Whereas the word latrio is to serve in a priestly or sacrificial manner. This word is translated into worship quite a few times, and we've got several of the verses down here, a lot more into the New Testament, is that translated worship instead of really it could be translated into a sacrificial service. It is a service. When they would serve one another, they would serve each other. They would serve God by doing certain things. So if we looked at it from that viewpoint, we kind of changed the idea of what does it say. Looking at them, let's see, trying to remember that one there. Acts 7, the first example here, verse 42. Most translations put verse 42 to say, "Then God turned and gave them up to worship the hosts of heaven, as is written in the book of the prophets." Looking at the context of that, what is God turning them to? We actually see where this is, if we back up, we see that in verse 37, he says, "This is what Moses, who said to the children of Israel, 'The Lord your God will raise you up a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you will hear.'" It talks about the idea that through their bondage and through, if we remember, the first exit out of Egypt, those people did not make it to the promised land because they chose to, as the versions here say, worship others. He turned them and let them worship others. They served the gods of their fathers. They served the gods of the Egyptian bondage. It's better translated, serve. When we take and serve other gods, or we serve our God in a daily fashion, it's not just worship. It's not just about worship. It's not just this one day a week or this 1 hour or 2 hours if we come both services while we're in here. It's not. It's so much more, and it's so much different. So to translate the word latrio into worship, we get the wrong idea about what it really is. Because when Christ talks about helping our brother, helping one another, teach all these things that we do to serve Christ are not always worship, but they are service. And so we look at it, they're both translated, unfortunately, to us as worship, but yet latrio is more accurately translated as service. And this is where we look at, and how we get it is like looking at Romans 12, 1 and 2. We see where this is important. In Romans 12, Paul gives us this focus here. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service." And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That is a very good definition of what Latrio should be in our lives today. How is it that this actually affects us? It is something that we are to do. It is our reasonable service. It is something that is acceptable to God as we go through and go forward. As we look at the overall study and thought about worship, a quick thought that hit my head is like, how has worship changed over the years? We look at it and we see a few little things. We've got the patriarchal time where we don't really have a lot of information. From Adam up until Moses, we don't have details. When Cain and Abel presented sacrifice to God, one was acceptable, one was not. How do we know what was or wasn't? They were told what it was. We just don't have it recorded. But we can see which one was accepted. We can also look in Hebrews and see that one was done through the heart, and we also see what actions were done as well. He may have said very specifically, give me this. He may have just said, give me a sacrifice from your heart, and Cain just gave a sacrifice because he had to give one. But we see that Abel was given one more succinctly and more appropriate. He had the sacrificial focus to him, the servant attitude. We also see in Joshua saying, choose you this day whom you will serve, the God of your fathers or the God of the Bible, that the true God. So not a lot is really said of how they're to worship him, but we know that they were to worship. We also have from the time of Exodus up until the time of Christ, either temples or synagogues. We have the tent that was out in the wilderness with them. Then they started building the temples. So they would actually do their worship there at the temples, at the different locations. And then we have the Christian time. Since Acts chapter 2, since the day of Pentecost, when the church was formed and brought into existence, we now have what Christ was saying in John 4, saying, the time will come where we won't go to a specific spot. We will worship him in truth and spirit. So with that, what does it look like today? What is the idea of worship for today? In spirit, I'm going to look at both words, the proskuneo idea, and I say idea because I'm going to come back to why I say that in a minute. But think about in John chapter 9. There was a man that was born blind. As he came across Christ and Christ healed him, the scribes, Pharisees, they tried to figure out, well, how did you see? Who sinned, you or your parents? And it's like, who healed you? We need to know this. Who healed you? A man did. I didn't see him. I was blind. It's like we forget this point. They're trying to trap Christ, and it's like a man healed me, told me to come and do my duty here. Then they asked his parents, well, who did it? He's of age, ask him. So all this back and forth, we get to the point where they kick him out. He is now healed. He is now back. Get out. What'd I do? He went back and found Christ, and he proskuneoed, worshipped Christ. He bowed down before Christ. He said, he worshipped him in this form where, what would we have done? Someone just took and gave us our eyesight for the first time. If today was the first day of your life that you could see because of Christ, what would your attitude towards Christ be? Would we look at him in the face and say, why didn't you come sooner? Or would we bow down to him in humbleness, in thankfulness, and in such thanksgiving, overcoming us? When we go through the idea that, in obedience to the gospel and we were baptized into Christ, do we come up thinking, well, look at me now? Or do we have this proskuneo? Do we have this desire to be humbled to Christ? To live our life in such a way? We also see this idea in Thomas. Oh, doubting Thomas. He finally came around. After Christ was dead and he raised from the grave, Thomas didn't see this the first time, so he was unsure about it. But all of a sudden, Christ showed up to him with the holes in his hands and the piercing in his side and said, Thomas, look. And he bowed down to him. He realized, and he cried out in John 20:28, saying, my Lord and my God. He didn't just say it. My Bible shows an exclamation point at the end of that statement. He called it out. He gave his all to Christ. To just bow down before somebody, anyone can do that. I can bow down before anyone in this room. I can get down on my knee and put my head down to the ground in front of you. But does it mean anything? Is it just a symbol of something? Or is it from the heart? And that is the idea that we need to pull from the proskuneo, is the idea of being in spirit. What is our spirit doing in the process as we do these? As we walk in this door, are we thinking, well, I got about an hour and then I can get back to what I was doing? Or are we thinking we are here for a reason? I am giving of my time because I could go do whatever I want, but I'm here to give. And that is the idea. It is a very thoughtful and should be emotional process. It should be coming from inside. If all we're doing is showing up and going through motions, we're just following a ritual. And unfortunately, that is something that Christ spoke against quite a few times. And that can be a thought for another lesson. But the other idea of being in spirit with the latrio, being of a servant mindset, is look at when in Acts chapter 7, in that passage, when Moses spoke of their fathers who served other gods of Egypt or other gods while away, even after they got away from all of that. They went out, they're sitting at the base of the mountain with the smoke covering it. They can hear the rumblings. They are in the presence of God and serving the gods of Egypt by saying, let's gather together our gold that we collected on the way out and let's make a calf. Let's worship something that we used to do back then. Let's cry and complain and moan and groan because God's providing everything for us, but we were more comfortable back there. That's not a good service. They're serving something. The choice is ours as to what we serve. Paul expresses his daily life in the way he describes it of how we are to live daily. You know, he shows Acts 24, verse 14. If anybody knows something about what we should be doing, Paul got a good proverbial slap in the face when he, on his road to Damascus, he woke up in a hard way about what he was doing. Acts 24 and verse 14, but this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. He says, I am now one of the way, which is what they called them at first, which is what they called Christians in the beginning. You're people of the way. Some of them then were even called a sect. We've had this little side conversation a couple of times today, actually, and they called them a sect. They called them a little group because it's like, oh, y'all are just breaking off. Y'all are just doing something weird, and y'all either get over it or get back with the program, come back to us. It's not just something. This is something to serve. But if you notice it, if they're calling them a sect, they've noticed something about this group called the Way, this group of Christians. They are doing something in their lives that is focused and purposeful. They have done something to make a name for themselves while not making a name for themselves at all. They are taking and doing something in the name of Christ, in the name of God, in their life. So what is it that we do? The other element now is that we look at our spirit. Are we doing this daily on purpose? It is not just about being, we walk in on Sunday, we put our Sunday clothes on, we walk in. When we get home, we take them back off. It's not about what we're wearing. It's not about the place we are. It's about being in spirit. Our spirit is with us each and every day. Is our spirit lying during certain parts of the week and then truthful to ourselves other places? Or is this us at all times? But we have to educate our spirit. We have to educate ourselves because we also have to worship in truth. And I think this is where we'll get into, probably be able to turn this into a series, as we'll look at each element of worship to see what is the truth of each one. But for now, what is truth in the overall? Jesus gives us the truth through the words which he spoke from the Father. When Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, what does that mean? As we look this morning, he has given us all things that he received from the Father. What the Father has said is truth. What he has said are the words of truth. We also are able to see all these things. In John 8, verse 31 and 32, then Jesus said to the Jews who believed him, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. If we abide in his word, we are, one, his disciples, and two, we will know the truth, because his word is truth. We can also look back into 1 John and see how he describes the idea that we have of fellowship with God through his truth. To be able to get to the truth, we have to know what the truth is. In 1 John 1, verse 5, he says, this is the message which he hath heard him and declared to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sins. If we say we have no sins, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. When we look at this element right there, how can we, if we say that we have fellowship with him and we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. How can we practice truth? Truth is either right or wrong. The application of, the ability to use that latrio root, that idea of servitude. What is in our life? Are we doing it? To be a servant is not just to do it while we're on duty, it is all the time. And we can look through John. He has several good examples of being in fellowship with God and it being matched up with the idea of being truth. The fellowship only comes in truth. That should be something to consider just within itself. So can we do it one without the other? I think people try all the time. I think that's part of the reason that we have so much division amongst this world, in our religious world, is that we have the division. We have spirit, we have truth. But even in that, sometimes it's a fragmented thing. It is not an educated spirit. It is not an ability to do it in full truth. And we have to do that word, that fullness of truth. It's so important that they must be together, that Christ said it in that one passage 2 times in that same thought. He only has to say it once for it to be something to be mindful of. But yet when we stop and think about John chapter 4, with the opening verses there, verses 23 to 24, 2 verses, he says it 2 times, in spirit and truth. It has to be both. If we don't worship or serve him in both, We are just going through earthly motions, and our worship will be done in vain. In vain do they worship me in the commandments and doctrines of men. Teaching for commandments, the doctrines of men. When we look at this idea, do we do things just because it's the ritual? Do we do things just because that's the thing to do? I had a phone conversation with someone this week trying to set up an event, and they asked to do something around Easter. I said, when? I had to go look at a calendar to figure out when that is, because what date the world sees Easter as and the importance that they give it is not the same importance I give it. Okay, I know what day Christmas is. That's the same day every year. It's also the day before my dad's birthday, so I do remember those two. But when is Easter? Some people just know the day. I'll admit, I don't pay attention to that part. We celebrate what the world celebrates. Let me back up and say it where it makes sense. The world celebrates Easter one day a year for the purposes that they celebrate it for. We celebrate it like that every day. We celebrate it every first day of the week. When we partake of the table, we partake and think about the death, burial, resurrection. We do it every Sunday. The world looks at it one time a year. There's a difference here. Out of spirit and in truth, we don't have to stop and think about it once a year. We think about it every week. So when all of a sudden the question is, well, we'll do it near Easter, I'm like, huh? I'm not as worried about Easter Day like the world is, because out of truth, I don't have to honor that day above the others, because I honor it every day in my service. Now, in looking at this, we talk about proskuneo, the bow down and worship, the humbling ourselves. Christ says that we are to do it in spirit. We're not told to actually come. We are told to gather together. We are not told to gather together and bow down before each other or before God. We don't have an altar to bow down before. We don't have anything that we are to submit ourselves physically to in worship. What we are told to do is have this attitude, have this inside of us that we let go of ourselves to serve God. So physically we do not have to proskuneo in worship, but yet in spirit, do we humble our spirit? If we allow ourselves to follow God's truth and the intent therein, then we will do both spiritually because of the truth. We will do it in the proskuneo sense, where we humble ourselves and bow down before God. We will also do it in the latrio sense of service to God in daily life. We serve God daily. We worship God on Sundays, on the first day of the week, in remembrance of all that He has done, in honor of what He has done. That is our proskuneo. That is our bow down before Him. Which brings to that last point, and probably one of the important points that we need to think about in worship, because sometimes people are like, well, I don't go because of fill in the blank. And especially when they fill it in of because I don't get anything out of it, the question really gets to, why are you coming? What do you expect out of it? Because coming to worship is more of a focus of us to God. Now, by doing that, we allow things to come in. God is to be the object or our focus of worship. Isaiah tells them that in the Old Testament. We see it again in the New Testament. We see it over and over. But Acts chapter 17, starting in verse 22. In this passage here, we see where Paul is in Athens and is speaking to a bunch of the philosophers, the people that sit around and come up with stuff all the time. He had just walked through their places of worship and of dedication. They have altars all around to all these different gods, and then he saw one to the unknown God. And here he takes and talks to them about this. His focus gets into, verse 22, then Paul stood in the midst of the Arpagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you, God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him to find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. And also some of you, your own poets have said, for we are all his offspring. The focus should be on God. Not with our hands, not with these altars that you've built, not with all these things and other stuff, but look at what God has done for us. We can do this for him. We are to come together to worship him. When we look at our worship, do we do it in spirit and in truth? Is our spirit that of a Christian? Have we put on Christ so that we are reflective of him? Do we take and do it in the idea and humbleness to serve? And service not just on the day of. Is our life a reflection of it? The one thing that the Sunday clothes analogy has right is that they're clean. If all you do is put on your Sunday clothes when you come to services, and you take them off as soon as you get home, they stay clean that way, don't they? Our life should be clean, renewed every day because we serve God each and every day. By service to him and asking, and through our prayers, we ask for our repentance when we do fall short. He cleanses us each and every day, so we don't have to worry about our spirit being dirty. We make a mistake, we get up, we brush it off, we keep going. We can do that through Christ. Is our spirit clean? Are we doing it in truth? And that gets to be the question. Where is our focus? Is the focus where it needs to be before we arrived? As we walk our daily life, do we remain in the truth? Do we do it each and every day? If we don't do it each and every day, then we've fallen short in our worship to God. Because we're telling him that you're only important one day a week. We don't worship him every day. But to worship him appropriately on that day, we have to live our lives appropriate as well, so that we're living in truth. When Christ asked the question at the judgment scene that he portrays about those who have fed him, clothed him, taken care of him, that's not just for a Sunday thing. That's an each and every day. That's when the need arrives, when we have that ability to do so. So as we conclude our worship today, I pray that it has been an edifying one for each of us, because in the acts of worship, we ourselves are able to be edified by those. But I also pray that we have done so in a way that God is pleased with each and every one of us, because that is him receiving the glory of our actions, and that our actions are in truth and according to his word. And as we go forward, let's continue to study more and to learn more and to make sure that we are in the truth. If anyone has need of the invitation to be more in line with the truth, to get our spirits corrected, we offer that invitation while we together stand and sing.